Thank you everyone for joining. I want to introduce myself. My name is Amina Deary, and I'm a JD candidate at Western Law. And I'm also the NIWHN Summer Law Intern with the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network for the summer. And I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Today's going to be a really great session, and we're also excited that you could join us. Before we begin, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. We recognize and acknowledge the ancestral territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We recognize the historic and ongoing impacts of colonization and are committed to ongoing decolonization of our systems and practices guided in our work by the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the TRC calls to action, and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls to justice, as well as the principles of Indigenous self-determination. Thank you for everyone who put in the chat where they're calling in from. I myself am calling in from Brampton, Ontario, and I'm really, really happy to be here with everyone today. Now, I'd like to invite Marie McGregor Pitawanaket to give an introduction and to help us open the session. Marie is the co-chair of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, as well as the co-chair for the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network. Marie.
Ani bonjour watchie. Mani McGregor Pete Wanted Dijinakas, Dodamin Donjaba, Dogan Pendao. Greetings everyone. My name is Marie McGregor Pitawanaket. I'm calling from Dodamin, which is South Bay in English. I'm a Dogan Prayer, which is South Bay. From the Rectification unceded territory on Manitoulin Island, Manitoulin, which is just north on the north shore of not the north shore, but just on the north end of Lake Huron in northeastern Ontario. I'd like to welcome you all here today and hoping that we have very positive, constructive discussions, and I look forward to talking with you all and to hearing Amina's presentation. I did want to talk a little about the right to housing and its connection with Indigenous peoples. And I wanted you to imagine, if you will, an Indigenous woman standing in front of a wigwam, which is a traditional missionary home, which is the dome-shaped structure made out of a very flexible wood frame. And in olden times, in some societies, it was the woman's responsibility to build the homes, manage the homes, and in some cases, move the homes. And if you look at some of the old-time historical photos of Plains people, there you'll see a woman standing with a horse, and the horse has a harness or a travois. And on that travois is a folded up animal skin tent covering. And in those cases, it was her job to move the homes as well. So something happened between then and now where we no longer build our own homes. We still try to manage them, and we are still responsible for those homes. So the rest of today's discussion is about how do we recapture our role and our responsibility for providing homes for ourselves? How do we exercise that right to housing? So on that note, I'll stop and turn it back over to Amina.
Thank you, Marie, for that opening and sharing your thoughts with us today. We're really, really glad to have you here, part of this presentation, and also to help facilitate our discussion later on today. Before we begin with the substantive presentation, I just wanted to make note of some housekeeping. Our session is being recorded today, and all participants who joined the session or who could not make it will be emailed a copy of the recording of our webinar. We're committed to making this safe space and accessible for everyone. So please read through our housekeeping items posted in the chat. Please also use the chat to let us know if you need any help. Our webinar today will be a discussion on the legal issues surrounding the right to housing and the implications this has on Indigenous women. So after the discussion, we will divide either into breakout rooms or, depending on if there are more participants, just an open room where we discuss some questions and have insights from participants on those questions that we'll be posing. So NIWHN hopes to create pathways for Indigenous women and gender diverse peoples to articulate what the right to housing looks like for them. And in this webinar, we hope to facilitate this through the focus group at the end of the presentation. We recognize that homelessness affects various groups, including Indigenous men, but this presentation is focused mainly on spotlighting the ways Indigenous women and gender diverse people are particularly vulnerable to homelessness, given their identity as Indigenous peoples as well as women. As illustrated in the Missing and Murdered and Indigenous Women and Girls report, homelessness disproportionately affects women, and this presentation will outline and highlight legal avenues and issues on the right to housing, particularly focusing on Indigenous women. If I could go to the next slide, I just want to lay out the agenda. So as discussed earlier, we had our opening by Marie, and then followed by a substantive discussion on the legal issues, as well as our acknowledgement highlighting that this presentation scope is limited to Indigenous women and gender diverse peoples. So to begin, for our slide going forward, before I begin on the substantive conversation on the legal issues implicated on the right to housing, I thought it would be important to highlight how new legal colonial frameworks are. In our discussions preparing this webinar, Marie pointed out to me how, looking at the historical research, that Indigenous legal frameworks and modes of thinking are extremely historical, old, and that the new legal colonial frameworks are ostensibly just not that far off from those Indigenous legal frameworks. So for example, our first picture illustrates that there's new evidence from the Indigenous archaeologist Paulette Steeves and her research, which suggests that artifacts and sacred sites show that Indigenous people were in North America more than 130,000 years ago. And if we compare that date to 1867 with the creation of the Indian Act, we can see how ostensibly Indigenous legal orders are just as substantive and much older than these newer colonial frameworks that govern a lot of Indigenous communities' lives and living. And it's important for us to realize that the laws that we'll be discussing, such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the National Housing Strategy Act, are all very new. And that in outlining these laws and exploring these laws, we need to illustrate and really recognize that there are other older substantive legal orders coming from Indigenous legal frameworks that we can look to. So for our next slide, I wanted to outline ostensibly the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and how it's implicated on the right to housing and our NIWHN's legal challenge that we hope to embark on. So if you're not aware, the Canadian Charter on Rights of Freedoms was enacted in 1982 and ensures certain rights and freedoms to all residents. So for the purposes of NIWHN's claim, the rights that are particularly important for us to look at are guaranteed under Section 7 and Section 15. So outlining what Section 7 entails, what the provision writes, it's that it ensures that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. And Section 15 also known as the equality guarantee, ensures every individual is equal before and under the law and has a right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. And in discussing the charter, many charter claims have been brought through the courts, and a lot of the times the courts are very narrow in their understanding of these rights and these guarantees. The charter, through all the jurisprudence that's come across the Supreme Court, it only protects against intrusions onto these rights. So if anyone is being deprived of the right to life or the right to liberty, then the charter protects against that. But the courts have interpreted that the charter does not provide for certain rights. So the charter, as you can see, does not provide for the right to housing. It does not provide for a right to substance, or a livable wage, for example. And in understanding this, we also need to look at how Indigenous understandings on the right to life are much more substantive and do not represent solely the right to be deprived of something as the Charter does. So many Indigenous communities recognize rights that the federal government has not recognized. And in doing so, it's important to understand that the Charter is quite limited, but it can be used as a tool to help realize certain rights or to push the courts forward into expanding their thinking. So moving on to the next slide, looking at international law is particularly important given the fact that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is very limited in its scope. So in looking at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, the articulation on the right to life is much more substantive in UNDRIP than the Canadian Charter. For example, Article 7.1 articulates that Indigenous individuals have the rights to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty and security of the person. And Article 7.2 of UNDRIP states that Indigenous peoples have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples and shall not be subject to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children of the group to another group. So in looking at both Article 7 as well as Article 5 and 6 posted on the slide, we can see that international law is a lot more broad and a lot more substantive in its scope. And looking at this, essentially Canada's Charter of Rights is a lot more limited. So looking at international law will help us in taking our claims to the courts to illustrate to them that there are other jurisdictions, international jurisdictions, or even other countries that have a much broader understanding on the right to life, and that it shouldn't be just limited to the understanding of the Charter. And moving on to the next slide, I thought it was very important to outline that colonial legal frameworks that outline homelessness usually only articulate a lack of housing, whereas an Indigenous view or perspective on this, as surveyed by Métis scholar Jesse Thistle, his surveying of Indigenous peoples and communities on what homelessness means to them outlined that homelessness includes 12 dimensions. So on the slide, we have historic displacement, we have spiritual disconnection, cultural disintegration and loss, contemporary geographic separation, mental disruption and imbalance, overcrowding, relocation and mobility, going home, escaping or evading harm, climatic refugees, as well as emergency crises. So these definitions are a lot more substantive. And I think one of the key themes of this webinar is that in looking at the legal frameworks that are outlined by the common law, the colonial understandings, they're very, very limited in their scope, very narrow, whereas Indigenous understandings and legal frameworks and articulations on the right to housing are a lot more substantive. So bringing that knowledge in and bringing those perspectives in a legal claim is extremely important as it outlines and articulates what homelessness or what housing needs to be by Indigenous communities. So moving on to our next slide, just to outline the current domestic law on the right to housing. I spoke about the charter earlier, and I noted that the charter does not provide for positive obligations. Essentially, what that means, a positive obligation, is for the government to provide something to the residents of its jurisdiction. It does not provide for positive obligations at this moment in time, but it does protect from intrusions onto rights that are already recognized. So the right to your security of person, the right to your liberty, the government cannot intrude on that. So an important case in understanding the right to housing was articulated in the Ontario Court of Appeal case, NIWHN and the Attorney General of Canada in 2014 at the Ontario Court of Appeal. Just to outline the facts of this case, it's quite a complex case, but essentially, for individuals who are experiencing homelessness, as well as extreme forms of poverty, as well as the Center for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, alleged that the actions and the inactions on part of both the Canadian government as well as the Ontario government resulted in their homelessness and inadequate housing, which they argued violated their charter rights, specifically their Charter 7 rights, the right to security of the person, as well as their Charter 15 rights, the equality rights. The case, sadly, was dismissed because the majority held that there was no legal component for which the courts to engage with decision-making capacity, since the appellants were not challenging any kind of law, statute, or policy. Essentially, they came to the courts, argued that the governments were not providing them housing, but they did not argue against or challenge a particular law, which is important when bringing on a charter claim. So, but what's also important, despite the fact that it could be seen as a loss for the right to housing, the court did not shut the door on the idea that governments have positive obligations to address homelessness. So while in that particular case, they did not win per se, they did not also dismiss that in the future there could be a time where the government would have to provide the obligation of housing to those individuals or any other individual who brings the challenge to the courts. And moving on to the next slide, on the topic of international law, Canada is committed to the right to housing under international human rights law. They have signed on to numerous treaties and ratified their participation in those treaties, particularly the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And this covenant recognizes that the states who sign on to this covenant have the obligation to progressively realize the right to housing and to undertake the equal right of men and women to the enjoyment of all economic, social, and cultural rights set forth in that covenant. And the covenant does recognize the right to housing. And while Canada is a signatory and has ratified the covenant, they've basically been failing on their obligations to provide culturally safe and adequate housing to Indigenous women. So in understanding international human rights law, in understanding our Canadian domestic law, and understanding what the Charter is saying, we can look to see where the government's failing and hope to capitalize on that so that we can enact and help to realize the right to housing. So the next slide is something that's quite important in bringing a claim to the courts for the right to housing. As you will have remembered in my discussion on the NIWHN case at the Ontario Court of Appeal, There was no specific law or policy that they were arguing against. They just went to the courts and brought this claim, this broad claim that the government was not providing for any housing and that violated their charter rights. And that was the main reason that the court dismissed their application, because there was no law. But now, with the enactment of the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019, the Canadian government, outlined the principles of the right to adequate housing as a fundamental human right and housing as a fundamental human right. And particularly, the Act articulates that housing is essential to the inherent dignity and well-being of the person. And within this Act, with this statute, Canada writes and is obliged to progressively realize the right to housing. Despite the fact that they have enacted this statute, the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network Human Rights Claim Report, Homeless on Homelands, which was published in 2022, highlights that there are various violations that the government is committing on the right to housing, which will be discussed in the next slide. So these 4 violations include the violation 1, which is the lack of action on the calls to justice from the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The second violation includes the failure to provide safe, adequate, and culturally appropriate housing on Indigenous women's own terms. And the third violation includes the interjurisdictional neglect, multiple systems failure, and intrusional betrayal. And the violation 4 includes the security of tenure under the National Housing Strategy Act and secure Indigenous land tenure. So in arguing that the government is failing to provide adequate housing and failing on its obligations under the National Housing Strategy Act, we now actually have an avenue for which to bring these violations to the courts and to have them address the violations, because there is a specific law, specific statute that we can fight up against, as opposed to prior to 2019, where there was no law that the courts could engage their decision-making capacity. So going on to the next slide, we'll have NIWHN's chair, Marie, share with us her experiences on the 4 violations and the effects the failure to provide safe and culturally appropriate housing has on Indigenous women. Marie, whenever you're ready.
All righty. Thanks for that beautiful synopsis of the laws that apply, Amina. Very clearly stated and very easy to understand, even though laws are complex. So I want to talk about the 4 violations about the right to housing. The first one, of course, is the violation of the right to culture and the right to housing. So when we talk about that as a practical example, the right to culture can appear in things like people gathering together to remove the quills from a porcupine. And the quills are important for using in crafts and in making items of cultural significance. And so there needs to be a place to be able to do that. If it can't be done outdoors, what kind of a venue indoors is available to assist? So that's what I mean by culturally appropriate housing. Another example would be when someone makes corn soup. Is there a place where you can use the fire and the ashes and the corn and the maple wood and so on and so forth to prepare the corn to make corn soup? And that can be done outdoors, but what if it needs to be done indoors? And is there a appropriate place inside the home to be able to do that? So that's what I mean about the rights to culture and the right to housing. If I can go to violation 2, the violation of the right to security and the right to housing. And so when I speak of security, I speak of personal security, being able to have a door that you can lock, being able to sleep in peace overnight, being able to keep your family safely together with you without interruption by dangerous forces. And if those are not available, then it connects with the lack of the right to housing. So those are interconnected and they're very important and they're very interdependent from an Indigenous woman's point of view. Violation 3 talks about the right to justice and the right to housing. And if you think of examples where Indigenous women, when they come into conflict with the law and are not heard properly and are incarcerated or put behind bars and not having the resources to obtain legal representation or not even knowing where to go for legal representation or not knowing what the laws say about what you have a right to. So that type of violation of the right to justice very much impacts on the right to housing. And so, say for instance, someone has gone through incarceration and is released. What are they released to? And are there any plans to release them into safe housing or into halfway homes or into supportive housing somewhere in the community? If that's not possible, if that's not provided, it's a violation of the right to justice. And the fact that there were and are murdered or missing Indigenous women speaks volumes about that violation of the rights to justice. It even talks about what happens when someone is assaulted in their own home and they're forced out. That's a violation of the right to justice. If I can turn now to violation number 4, violation of the right to health and the right to housing. Um, the right to the right to health is also very interconnected with the right to housing. Housing is seen as a social determinant of health. And if you look at the statistics and the news reports about housing across the country where there is severe overcrowding, where a majority of homes are in Indigenous communities are in major need of repair, where there is a severe lack of housing, and also where um, things like mold and mildew and other environmental hazards are not addressed properly. Even communities where a boil water advisory exists after 30 years, and how many hundreds of those communities are there, that talks about the violation of the right to housing and the violation of the right to health. So each of those 4 are interdependent and they're interconnected and you cannot divide them out. So I guess what I'm saying is that Indigenous women, gender diverse and two-spirit people have these rights to culture, to security, to the right to justice, to the right to health, in connection with the right to housing. And if you think about our ancestral customs, where in times past it was women who were able to build homes, to move the homes, to look after the homes, not in all societies, but in many. And what happened between then and now, where we're even scared to look sideways at a hammer, never mind being able to build our own homes. So what needs to happen is we need to recover that capacity to provide housing for ourselves. And at the same time, we need assistance from those external sources, as in the law, as in government policy, as in social service housing, as in communities' respect for women and the children. And so all of those items are so important. And so what you have now is a disproportionate number of Indigenous peoples who are counted among the homeless. You have disproportionate number of women, Indigenous women, two-spirit and gender diverse that are counted among the precariously housed and the homeless in Canada. And I want to throw out this number and it kind of gives you a scope of the size of the situation. Canada consists of 9,985,000 square kilometers of land from coast to coast to coast. It is the second largest landmass in the world. And how is it possible that there is even one person homeless on land the size of that? And given the amount of resources and wealth that this country has, why is it that there are even any homeless at all? And so that's my question. The answer to that question is what drives me, and the answer to that question is what brings me to this work as the chair of the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network and the co-chair of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. And so I wanted to bring those to you, and I thank Amina very much for her synopsis of the law as it applies to housing. I know it's very complex and wide-ranging. And what we've tried to do today is to digest and synopsize and to make it as concise as possible. And then too, we've got 12 recommendations for a solution. One of the recommendations is to look at secure land tenure. Because when you're looking at housing, you look at, okay, well, where are we going to build this housing? Well, Indigenous lands. And the reason that we say Indigenous lands is that the lands now called Canada were formed by making treaties between sovereign Indigenous nations, sovereign Indian nations, and the British Crown. A treaty is not possible unless you have sovereign nations to negotiate those treaties. So a number of treaties were set up all across Canada. And the reason they exist is so that land could be parceled out to non-Indigenous people who has to build homes and create industries, build railroads, build roads, build infrastructure, build all kinds of things. And so what you have now is that the treaties have never been undone. They've never been negated. And what needs to happen is that the terms of the treaties need to be enforced. What does that mean? It means that the lands are still owned by Indigenous people, and that the 1/3 of 1% that is set aside for Indian people is what's called Indian Reserve Land. 1/3 of 1% is not nearly enough land to support 1.67 million Indigenous people in this country. So we need to look at ways to provide land for housing for Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people off reserve as well as on reserve. So it widens the perspective of what land is available when you think about that 9,985,000 square kilometers. And so the land is there. And actually, when you think about our ancestral way of thinking about the land, it's not an inanimate thing. To us, land is animate, and we give her a name, and she is called Mother Earth. So that land is both animate and female, and also is a gift to Indigenous peoples to look after. And so we need to capture that gift of looking after that land again, so that the climate crisis that we're now in doesn't overtake and make all of us human beings disappear. On that note, I'll stop, and I hope that this has been helpful, and I look forward to the remainder of our discussion. Jimmy Gretsch.
Thank you so much, Marie, for sharing your insights on the 4 violations as well as the recommendations. It's so insightful to have you here today to share with the group as well as with myself on what it means to move forward, as well as articulate what those violations are. So moving forward to the next portion of this webinar. One of the purposes of the webinar is to outline the legal claim that the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network is embarking on, and to solicit insights from the community on how that claim should be articulated. So essentially, the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network is embarking on a novel claim against the federal government, alleging that the minister's failure to comply with the commitments under the National Housing Strategy Act in relation to Indigenous women and gender diverse people violates their Section 7 security of the person and their Section 15 equality rights. And as discussed earlier, we now have an act on which we can allege these violations, the National Housing Strategy Act. While this claim is novel and has essentially not been brought to the courts with any success, in NIWHN, they didn't have a statute. Now we do have a statute. Um, whether or not this claim does succeed through that legal avenue, through the courts, NIWHN believes that articulating that governments have the obligation to provide positive rights to Indigenous women on the right to housing is worth it, regardless of whether that results in a court win. So into the focus group section of this webinar, moving forward with our claim, on the next slide, we've outlined 2 goals of the webinar. So our first goal is to create pathways towards Indigenous women, to articulate what the right to housing looks like for them. And our second goal, which is the focus group. So that goal is to have a public record on which Indigenous women and gender diverse peoples' thoughts are on the right to housing. So have a recorded articulation on what the right to housing looks like from the community. So our next portion will be the focus group. In our breakout room, we had a great discussion. And we wanted to open it up to the main group if anyone wants to volunteer, just some insights to share with the main group. And then we can go on into just a general Q&A. I do see that it's 3 o'clock now, just going up until 3 o'clock. But we're happy to stay back a few minutes for the Q&A, or if anyone wants to share their insights. So, and also totally understand if anyone also has other commitments and needs to leave at 3 o'clock. This session will be recorded and sent to all the participants. So does anyone want to share just with the main group on stuff that they learned, or any insights that were particularly helpful from the webinar, or anything that they are going to be using going forward with the work that they're doing in their communities?
I'll just share this because I just had this like aha moment for me, because we do have residents here at the college, but I really think that maybe using a lot of the policies and documents here, I could probably advocate for space to be held specifically for Indigenous students, especially females, and those with families. So right now we don't allow anyone with family into residence, but I think that's an oversight on our part because a lot of our students are women with families. So I'm probably going to take all of this stuff forward and try to secure some spaces in our residence for our women. But again, thank you for sharing all this. This is really all new to me. And I learned a whole lot today, and commend you for all the really good work that you're doing. Miigwech.
Thank you, Natalie. Anyone else want to share, like no pressure to do so, or if there's any questions that anyone has, they can, email them to me. I think that my email will be sent with the participants, or just the anyone here. I'm sure Marie will also be happy to connect with people going forward. Given that, if there isn't anything else, I do want to say thank you very much for your time today. It was great to have everyone here and join the webinar, as well as share sort of the work that NIWHN's doing. It's super important for us to connect with the community and help to articulate the claim going forward, given that this will be affecting the community. So we will be following up over email with the links to the recording of today's webinar, as well as my email and Marie's email for any follow-ups that anyone has. Thank you so much for your active participation, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. It was great to meet everyone, great to see some lovely faces, and I hope we do meet again. Thank you, everyone.